So, picking up from our previous discussion on the foundational aspects of Durkheim's thought, we now delve into how the landscape of his study has dramatically shifted over the last century. It wasn't until roughly three-quarters of the 20th century that scholars really started to grasp the full scope of what Durkheim was driving at. And once that understanding dawned, and with the broader historical context changing, boom, a massive surge of new research followed. This volume, much like others appearing recently, signals a clear trend. The center of gravity in Durkheim studies has decisively moved away from his early and middle period work towards his later writings. We're not expecting this to be the final word either. With this new Durkheim firmly established, the intellectual agenda for his next 100 years is fundamentally altered. Think about it this way. During Durkheim's first century, the big buzzwords were things like structure, function, method, social fact, anomie, suicide, law, socialism, division of labor. These are the concepts that dominated scholarly debates back then. But now? They're kind of yesterday's news, the opening act. We're at the end of that beginning. What's taken the stage are new stars, ritual, collective representations, and discourse, the sacred, solidarity, collective conscience, democracy, interaction. And from these, a whole new constellation of interests is emerging. Concerns about performance, justice, regulation, transgression, evil, memory, networks, civil society, morality, punishment, body, practice, difference, emotion, narrative. It's a whole different intellectual playground. What does all this mean for the field? Well, look at those lists of concepts. They suggest the area of themes and connections to explore is expanding upwards, potentially leading to what Bataille called productive excess, lots of creative energy, lots of new ideas bubbling up. It's not spiraling downwards into entropy, into meaningless complexity. Instead, we're entering a phase where complexity will be built, not reduced, through the dynamic interplay of these newer concepts. Now, can we predict exactly what fascinating applications or insights, what talismanic hands, these signifiers will yield in our lifetimes? Probably not. Nobody's handing out tarot cards here. That said, resources like this Cambridge Companion do offer diverse perspectives on where Durkheim left his calling card and where he might be heading next. Sharp readers will definitely start mapping their own intellectual journeys based on this. Now let's talk about Durkheim himself. When you glance at his entry in a dictionary like Petit-Robert, it's pretty brief. French sociologist, taught at Bordeaux and Sorbonne, founder of L'Année sociologique, studied collective representations. Sounds neat, right? But in reality, especially outside France, where he's become almost a cult figure, he's often presented through some well-worn stereotypes. Think of him as the organicist, the functionalist, the positivist. The Jewish philosopher who became a university professor, led a tight-knit group via his journal, and was basically a conservative thinker obsessed with keeping society together and morally integrated. These are useful shorthand labels, sure, but they miss so much. Thankfully, Stephen Luca's groundbreaking biography from 1972 tried to cut through this. Based on incredible archival work, letters, manuscripts, interviews with family Lukes, aimed for a real historical understanding and critical judgment. His book, structured both chronologically and thematically, was a real game changer, though sadly, it hasn't even been translated into French yet. Since Luke's work opened the door, interest in Durkheim and his circle has exploded. We've had more access to archives, revealing new letters, unpublished writings, even student notes. Key figures like Philippe Besner in France, W.S.F. Pickering in England, Robert Alun Jones in the U.S., and Massimo Borlandi in Italy have been instrumental. New journals dedicated to Durkheimian studies have popped up. There's been a real rebirth of his texts, including volumes of his correspondence with collaborators like Mauss and Hubert. Even administrative reports and book reviews are surfacing. This isn't just academic navel-gazing. It's reflected in a surge of PhD theses and books focusing on Durkheim and his school of thought. The field is definitely buzzing. Looking at Durkheim's career path is relatively straightforward. First, he was a philosophy teacher in various lycées across France. Then, after a stint studying in Germany, he landed a position in Bordeaux in 1887, initially as a chargé de cours, later becoming a professor of social science and pedagogy. Finally, in 1902, he moved to the prestigious Sorbonne in Paris, starting as a suppléant for Ferdinand Buisson, eventually securing the chair in sociology in 1913. If you want to pinpoint his most productive years, the Bordeaux period is generally considered the peak. That's when division of labor, rules, and suicide rolled out, plus the launch of L'Année sociologique. But mapping his work chronologically is trickier. For a long time, the assumption was that Durkheim never really changed his core ideas. He was one of those rare thinkers whose fundamental beliefs remained constant. However, a more recent wave of scholarship is asking, did a young Durkheim exist, distinct from an old Durkheim? Was there a shift? Some argue yes. Alexander suggested a young, more materialist and determinist phase versus an older, more idealistic and benevolent one seen in elementary forms. Where do we draw the line? Hypotheses vary. Lukes and Lacroix pointed to early works before Bordeaux. Nye included Rules and Suicide. Giddens, Hawkins, and Murgy proposed a period running roughly from 1883 or 1885 up to 1893, just before Rules. Then there's the idea of a transition period around 1894 to 1896, marked by his first course on religion, reading Robertson Smith, and the death of his father. Durkheim himself called this a revelation, a dividing line in his thought. So the debate is definitely ongoing. Let's dig into Durkheim's roots. He was born in Epinal, a small town in Lorraine, in 1858. His father, Moïse Durkheim, was the chief rabbi of the region, and his grandfather before him. Apparently, there was an unbroken line of 8 generations of father-son rabbis. His mother, Mélanie, came from a respected family. Her father traded horses. Interestingly, while culture was traditionally masculine in their household, business was feminine, with his sisters working alongside his mother. The family atmosphere was described as austere, deeply religious, highly respectful of tradition and the written word. Young Emile was serious, introverted, very sensitive, and prone to feeling remorse even for pleasure. Being Jewish in provincial France meant being part of a small, cohesive yet somewhat marginal community. Durkheim later recalled getting the taste of collective life early on, appreciating the pleasure of saying we instead of I. Now, how did this rabbinical background play out? It's complex. While the family spoke French at home, and the father seemed relatively modern compared to other rabbis, no beard, contemporary clothes, they used French names for the boys and pronounced their surname differently than the German Durkheim. Signs of wanting to integrate. Education was clearly the path to social mobility for a young provincial Jew. Durkheim was expected to follow in his father's footsteps, learning Hebrew and Talmud, but he also attended secular schools. There's even a story about a brief crisis of mysticism influenced by a Catholic teacher. Academically, he was a star, skipping grades, winning awards. He later framed his pursuit of higher education not as abandoning tradition, but as needing better weapons to fight prejudice. His father, surprisingly, supported his move to Paris for studies, seeing academia as a modern equivalent to the priesthood. At the École Normale Supérieure, despite requests for Sabbath exceptions, he stayed and excelled, even preparing a conference on Jews in the Roman Empire. It seems he was grappling with his identity, confirming it culturally while simultaneously turning it into a subject for rigorous study. This brings us to the big question: did Durkheim's Jewishness fundamentally shape his sociology? Clark argued it explained his interest in sociology due to marginality. Moore suggested it informed his view of religion, pointing to Judaism's emphasis on ritual action over belief, and seeing parallels between his analysis of sacrifice and contemporary Jewish perspectives. Others have drawn links between Jewish sensibility and collectivism, Talmudic concepts of God or justice, and even nostalgia for ancient Israel manifesting in his interest in primitive societies like the Arunta. But Pickering warns against simplistic essentialism. Generalizing about Jewishness is fraught with danger. Strensky offers a more nuanced view, looking at Durkheim within the specific world of French liberal Jews, noting the overlap between Durkheimians and scholars like Sylvain Lévy, working on the science of Judaism, and analyzing what he calls methodological ritualism. It's clearly a debated topic, requiring careful contextualization rather than easy answers. So, what was Durkheim's actual relationship with Judaism? It was undeniably complex. On one hand, he remained connected to his Jewish roots, staying within the family circle, experiencing anti-Semitism firsthand, maintaining ties with the community, marrying Louise Dreyfus, a wealthy Jewess, in 1887, supporting Jewish causes during World War I, and being buried in the Jewish section of Montparnasse Cemetery. On the other hand, his lifestyle was clearly one of assimilation. He lectured on Saturdays in Bordeaux, didn't attend synagogue, didn't keep kosher, gave his children non-Hebrew names, and controversially decided against a traditional synagogue wedding for his daughter, which caused rifts with his own sister. So yes, he was a Jew, but also a thoroughly assimilated Frenchman navigating multiple identities. Politics. Durkheim lived through the Third Republic, a period marked by instability after the Franco-Prussian War. It was often called the République des Professeurs because it aligned with Jules Ferry's push for secular education. The buzzwords were democracy, secularism, and science. Durkheim was clearly sympathetic to Republican ideals, especially Ferry's vision. He famously stated, "To remake it, it must be first educated." His appointment to Bordeaux was partly due to his Republican credentials. He valued individual dignity, rights, free thought, democratic institutions, tolerance and pluralism, classic liberal values. Early on, he read Albert Schaffel, a German historian critical of pure individualism and economic liberalism, which resonated with Durkheim's emphasis on society. The big question hanging over French intellectual life, and one Durkheim grappled with, was, does the individual come first, or does society? What is democracy? What role for corporations? How do we balance individual freedom with social cohesion? Durkheim's initial foray into the social sciences was critiquing political economy. This led him to develop his own perspective. What holds nations together? What's the role of authority? Is life just a struggle for survival? Does society need a strong central government? He was fundamentally critical of utilitarian liberalism and laissez-faire economics. He rejected the idea of natural rights and saw society not just as a marketplace, but as a system of interlocking rights and duties. His views evolved. He started distrusting mass opinion, but later became fascinated by the creative effervescence of crowds. He shifted from a more activist view of citizenship to questioning direct elections. Hawkins notes that his vision, a corporatist society under a strong state, with indirectly elected members, grounded in universal human rights, is hard to fit neatly into conventional ideological boxes. Cladis sees it as either corporatism compatible with republicanism or a communitarian defense of liberalism. It's definitely a complex relationship. Then came the Dreyfus Affair. In 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish artillery officer, was framed for treason. This erupted into a massive national scandal, pitting anti-Semitics against defenders of Dreyfus. Durkheim, who had personally experienced anti-Semitism, took a firm stand early on. He actively participated in the League for the Defense of Human Rights, recruiting members in Bordeaux and even convincing the socialist leader Jean Jaurès to throw the weight of the socialist movement behind the cause. He co-founded La Jeunesse Laïque, addressing issues like religion, freedom of thought, and individualism. Crucially, Durkheim wasn't primarily motivated by political expediency or his own Jewish identity, though he felt insecure about both. He acted, he said, in the name of moral principle. He saw the affair as a serious moral perturbation, a public flail threatening the moral fabric of France. His priority was saving our moral patrimony. He fiercely defended individualism, distinguishing it from egoism, framing it as the defense of human dignity, the cult of the individual, and social justice. This stance, being both Republican and a Dreyfusard, likely played a significant role in advancing his academic career, helping him move from Bordeaux to the prestigious Sorbonne in Paris. Okay, so Durkheim was pro-Dreyfus, but what about socialism? He was clearly wary. Like many of his generation, he feared chaos, anarchy, rising social movements, unchecked individualism. He saw these as threats to national unity. He explicitly contrasted his sociology with Marxism, arguing that religion, not economics, is the primary matrix of social facts. He criticized despotic socialism early on. His relationship with his nephew, Marcel Mauss, who was a Marxist, was interesting. While Durkheim didn't try to convert him, he did teach a course on socialism, starting with Saint-Simon, who ironically founded both socialism and positivist sociology. Durkheim approached socialism objectively, treating it as a powerful social fact, an ideology with potential for higher morality and justice. He insisted it needed to be compatible with individualism, specifically equality of opportunity. Many of his collaborators were involved in socialist circles, aligning with Jaurès' reformist approach rather than Guesde's revolutionary Marxism. Durkheim himself was searching for a third way, a synthesis between individualism and socialism, perhaps incorporating economic groups or corporations. He believed sociology could provide this solution, and he urged his nephew Mauss to avoid getting sidetracked by the allure of the crowd, emphasizing the sociologist's role as scholar, advisor, and educator, not a politician. Now, let's zoom out to the broader cultural milieu of fin de siècle France. Think symbolism in art reacting against positivism, emphasizing the inner world suggestion. And alongside this, a new wave of psychology, the psychologie nouvelle. This field was fascinated by the human interior as a complex system of nerves, hypnosis, suggestion, dreams. Figures like Charcot and Bernheim were huge names, and hypnosis was all the rage. Durkheim himself attended the First World Congress of Psychology in Paris in 1889. A major concern was neurasthenia, a condition linked to the stresses of modern urban life, characterized by mental hypersensitivity and physical exhaustion. This diagnosis resonated widely. Alongside this was the idea of degeneration, a syndrome identified by Morel decades earlier but gaining traction in the 1890s. It was used to explain perceived declines in French vitality, comparing birth rates, crime, alcoholism, etc. to Germany. Theories pointed to hereditary factors or simply an unhealthy social environment. The language shifted from healthy sick to normal abnormal. How did Durkheim engage with this wave of psychological concern? He wasn't immune. An early article hinted at moral factors in suicide. His lectures on children's suggestibility were part of moral education. In Division of Labor, he discussed anxieties and psychic problems arising when the collective conscience weakens. His work essentially developed a collective psychology. He used metaphors like nervous currents and waves, arguing that psychic issues had social roots, not just individual pathology. He talked about happiness, harmony, moderation, the right environment. In Suicide, he analyzed egoistic and anomie types, linking them to what he called the sickness of the infinite. He identified collective sadness, arguing melancholia was more common in modern societies but only pathological if excessive. He stressed measure and harmony, needing both optimism and pessimism. He even used neurasthenia as an example of relativism. What's sick for an individual might be normal for society. He coined hyper-civilization to describe modernity's refinement, making people overly delicate and susceptible. He treated neurasthenia as socially caused, angering free will proponents and alienists. The early issues of L'Année sociologique reflected this interest, exploring connections between social, psychological, and biological phenomena, and delving into belief, ritual, magic, taboo, and even the social unconsciousness. And Durkheim wasn't just theorizing about this, he lived it. He suffered from neurasthenia and melancholia himself. Letters from 1902 reveal his struggles with a malaise mental, a lamentable dulling, a feeling of moral shrinking. He endured a particularly tough winter in 1902 to 1903. His network included psychologists like Ribot and Janet. Then World War I broke out in 1914. His nephew Marcel Mauss enlisted. For the second time in his life, Durkheim threw himself back into active politics, serving on government committees and writing propaganda pieces. So there's the man, the thinker, grappling with the anxieties of his time, his own health, and the world's crises. His legacy is precisely this complexity, constantly inviting reinterpretation beyond the simple labels.